Tim, there's been another government initiative, this time to tackle extremism, from racism to religion to misogyny. Question is Yvette Cooper right to act? Or is this another misplaced government initiative which won't solve the problems the UK is certainly facing? And will it just end up curtailing our freedom to speak? We're going to be speaking to author and commentator Ella Whelan. And at the end, the big reveal. What is the funniest joke at Edinburgh Festival Fringe? And Tim, a question that Camilla and I have already answered. What is your favourite joke?
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Tim Stanley.
And me, Kamal Ahmed. So Tim, we woke up this morning to a statement from the Home Office, a quote from Yvette Cooper. You and I have been talking this through ever since our morning meeting at 10 o'clock, saying what actually does it mean? So I'm just going to test you, Tim, on this. I'm going to read out literally from the announcement that was made overnight. And it says this, and I just want to get your reaction to it. The Home Secretary has commissioned a rapid sprint to drive a new practical approach to countering extremism. The sprint will aim to ensure extremism is tackled across the country, online and offline. The Home Secretary has pledged a step change in tackling extremism to ensure communities are protected better. The sprint, which will look across the ideological spectrum, will kickstart a strategic reset on how government tackles extremism and addresses gaps in the current system. Very difficult to even read, Tim, but what may it mean?
It's like every email from HR ever condensed into one document, isn't it?
I think ChatGPT has written that, but anyway, let's put that to one side.
A rapid sprint for a kickstart for a new strategy. I can hear Simon Heffer screaming in Essex. So what the government is trying to hint at is that it's trying to get on top of the undeniable problem of violence against women and girls by taking another look at what it says is outdated guidance on tackling extremism, which was written in 2015. And one thing that has stood out to people is a new emphasis upon extremist misogyny. Now, by doing this, of course, they raise loads of questions. Are they doing this, talking about it, rather than actually focusing upon the nuts and bolts of policing? Are they opening a can of worms with this use of extreme misogyny as a phrase, which can be incredibly wide in definition? One thinks about debates around gender identity or Islamophobia. You know, are you going to be able to be critical of religions and their attitudes on gender? Will the police understand the limits of whatever it is the government's trying to do? We've had someone, a lady who was arrested twice for praying silently outside an abortion clinic. The police subsequently let her go, apologised and paid her money, and the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, had to write a letter to them saying, you know what, standing outside an abortion clinic silently thinking to yourself is not a crime. And is the government trying to identify bogeymen, quite literally, who are responsible for complex cultural and social problems? Is Andrew Tate to blame for every problem that men have that gets turned into extremist attitudes towards women?
And as you say, Tim, Yvette Cooper said that the extremism policy, and we've both struggled to actually think what does that achieve, but has not been updated. It was David Cameron and Theresa May who actually published the former government's policy around extremism in 2015. It was all about partnerships and working together and community cohesion, but it was much more focused on the far right and Islamist extremism.
Yes.
I read through it this morning, and actually misogyny, the hatred of women, is only mentioned, by about page 10. It is mentioned in there, but as you say, the point that has been taken from what has happened in Yvette Cooper's announcement today is that the word misogyny is much clearer, and has those groups of ideas, have they become strong enough to go beyond what incel culture has started discussing, to become an almost ideology of hatred of a group of people?
Yeah.
And we'll see, once presumably the review is published, what the government's new thinking is on that issue. So to discuss all that, we're joined by Ella Whelan. She's the author of What Women Want, Fun, freedom and an end to feminism. And she's also the convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival.
Ella, thank you very much for joining us. It's nice to have you with us. Look, we all agree that misogyny is bad. We would all like to do something to fix it. What is the best strategy in your mind? Is it right to go through the government's kind of strategy, or is there some other way of tackling it that you'd prefer?
I actually think the way in which the government is handling this, and to be fair, almost every previous government, it's now a sort of expectation that you flirt with some kind of idea of either criminalizing misogyny or having some kind of review on it, or looking like you're doing something in capital letters about misogyny. I think that the current approach is actually damaging to women's liberation, women's freedom, and in a way cements the kind of, I would call it sexism, maybe you want to call it misogyny, that still is apparent in society. And that's because if you think about what actually causes sexism and misogyny, what's kind of behind this idea of men committing violence, or even just men being nasty to women, it's the idea that women are weaker, that we're not equals, that we are psychologically as well as physically incapable of standing on the same level as men. And by bringing in protective safety measures, whether it's through legislation or more police powers or whatever, you are giving the green light to that view, to those men out there, that these damsel in distress, wussy women need to have the state protecting them. Now, obviously, no one is being stupid. Women are most of the time physically weaker than men, and we do need someone to step in when somebody is physically threatening us. No one would deny that. But in the realm of speech, in the realm of ideas and words, even words and ideas that are incredibly unpleasant and horrible and sexist, we need to say that we stand on equal footings, and that there isn't this kind of nice big brother in the form of a police officer or a parliamentarian looking out for us, because it damages our independence. There is a big difference for me between safety and freedom, and one negates the other. If you are constantly being, saying that safety is so most important, you're giving away your freedom. I think that's a really big problem for women.
If I can push back on that a little bit, I think what people who support this kind of strategy would say is that safety is essential to freedom. That the government has to do certain things to guarantee that women can flourish, because although theoretically it would be nice if we could just leave everyone alone, and through the power of debate we'd all realize that sexism is wrong and therefore we would stop doing it, the reality is misogyny is out there. It limits what women can do. Therefore, it impinges upon their safety and thus their freedom. And so it's just common sense and necessary for the government to directly tackle misogyny in its root causes.
Well, I think it becomes women being afraid of sexism, and I don't mean that in a sort of flippant way. Women, having their ability to act in society hampered by the prospect that a boss, for example, might be sexist, or that a partner that they meet might be violent. I think these become self-fulfilling prophecies, because we talk up the idea that, for example, it's quoted in some of the reports around what the government is planning to do, that misogyny is endemic in the workplace. That's, misogyny means a hatred of women. It doesn't just mean outdated views, nastiness, off-color remarks. It means a hatred of women. That to say that misogyny is endemic in the workplace is just absurd. It's not women's lived experience, to use that awful term. There was a really good example of what I mean, which is when that horrific crime was committed against Sarah Everard, and she was, brutally murdered. The discussion about women's violence against women became centered around the idea of women walking the streets at night and how dangerous it was for women to walk the streets. And this instance, this rare and terrible instance of a woman being essentially abducted, and the nightmare situation that happened to Sarah Everard, was broadened out as if this was something that a danger that women face daily. And that isn't true. And what happened was it caused a real panic, particularly among young women, who then were reported as saying, well, I'm not going to go out. So it became this self-fulfilling prophecy. And if you look at any of the, whether it's the ONS stats or any of the data collected around this, we know that the by far the biggest chunk of data on what kind of violence gets committed against women is in a domestic situation. It's domestic abuse. It's women who are suffering at the hands of people who they know, their relatives, their partners. And that's not to say that what happened to Sarah Everard was in any way less terrible, or that women should be silly about their safety on the streets. But if you are feeding an idea that once we step out of our houses, we are barraged by misogyny, danger, murderers, rapists, you're going to make women feel like they can't leave the house. And that in itself is, to me, actually, that's probably more damaging for women's freedom, because it's very unlikely that I'm going to get, nabbed by some horrible copper and killed. But it is likely that I won't be able to go about my daily business as free as any man because I'm scared of that prospect. So I think we have to be really careful about fear-mongering and how that affects women.
Okay, if I can just channel the spirit of Jez Phillips, and I won't do the accent, but if you just imagine this as Jez speaking to you, she would say to you, it's not an irrational fear, it's a fear which reflects the statistics. So a report published by the National Police Chiefs Council in July found that more than 1 million violent crimes against women and children were recorded in the year to March 2023. Violent crimes against women and girls have risen by 37% in 4 years. Now, if we were talking about racist crimes, we would say, let's not just police the crime. Let's also look at the ideology. Let's look at the hate speech which drives people towards becoming racist and thus down the track committing these crimes. Why not apply the same principle to sexism? You mentioned the Sarah Everard case. The policeman who was responsible for her killing, of course, was a flasher before he was a killer. So so what I suspect the government would say is, look, we shouldn't just be picking up the problem when it has occurred, when the crime has been committed. Let's actually tackle the bad ideas that encourage the misogyny that translates into violence against women and girls, which is going up.
Well, to come back to Jess Phillips, I mean, the thing that she does extremely successfully in Parliament is bring to attention the specificness of domestic abuse, which is that it's a really important factor in this discussion, that the vast majority of the problem around violence against women happens in a home situation and tragically, the vast majority of those women have already reported the men, whether it's their uncles, their dads, their husbands, ex-partners, to police for minor infringements, whether it's stalking or threats. And it's police inadequacy that is to blame for a huge amount of the women that die at the hands of men, because of missed reports, because of things that happened, similar to Wayne Couzens, people saying to women, oh, it's not that big a problem, go home, love, and sort it out yourself, it's a domestic situation. I want that to change. I want that to change drastically. I have no time for any kind of at the moment, there's so much sort of lionization of the police. I think the police do a terrible job, particularly when it comes to women, most of the time. And funnily enough, that's probably part of the reason why I don't really trust police officers to be my knight in shining armor when it comes to dealing with sexist views or anything else. That aside, I think we have to be able to separate that from, I do want to talk about a different, less sort of physically intense discussion around vestiges of sexism left in society. So, every woman of a certain age you'll talk to, actually probably a lot of teenage girls as well, will tell you that they have had some kind of uncomfortable, to put it lightly, or maybe even scary interaction with man, whether that's someone wolf whistling, although I really think that doesn't happen very much anymore, or comments, someone staring at them at the bus. And that's an experience that doesn't happen to boys, and so it's worth talking about that. And for me, I would say the way to solve that is for us to get a little bit more serious about women's liberation, to talk about the things that still make men and women an equal. I'm in the business of being a mother now, and the sort of contrasts in experiences, are quite stark still, even in 2024, in terms of gender roles and all the rest of it. That all feeds into an image of or a view of what women's role in society is, which affects sexist views. So let's talk about it. I'm not waiting for Yvette Cooper to wrap them on the wrists and tell them that they've been naughty boys. It's just not in touch with reality to suggest that this would be the solution.
Listening to the two of you, I don't think you're maybe quite as far apart as the questioning might suggest. I love the phrase you use, Ella, in the Telegraph. We need to get a bit more steel toe cap about women's liberation and less damsel in distress. Social norms are changed in society by members of society, not by parliamentarians. Ella and Tim, I'd like to ask both of you this. As a mixed black man, I have very similar senses to you, Ella. When you talk about racism and violence against people of colour, if you get to a stage at which we all just feel victims and scared, that is no way to live a life, and you have to have a more positive debate. Ella, has your opinion changed on the issues of where the law should be taking action, given the changes in online distribution? Tim and I have spoken about the police's role in this, and speaking to senior police executives, they say to me the bar to publication now of material that is incitement to violence is so low that the law does need to be changed, and we need to reopen the debate about harmful but legal. So just Ella first, has your view changed at all because of what is now permissible or able to be delivered online via social platforms, that we do need law there, or regulation at least, maybe one step below actual law, to stop incitement to violence against women on platforms that's not actually directly physical violence?
No, a big fat no. I'm if anything, to use kind of extremist language, I've become more fascistically pro free speech, given the sort of discussion about online harms and online safety of late, because again, it just does not reflect reality. I mean, there was a really interesting poll done by Demos quite a few years ago. I think it was around sort of the Me Too-ish era, that revealed that a lot of the deeply unpleasant commentary around women online was, surprise, surprise, done by other women. And there was this sort of complex nature of the way in which, in particular, views of women were being expressed online. It wasn't, I think the discussion about women is sort of different from, for example, discussions about Islamism or even racism. It's sort of, it takes a different kind of tone, because a lot of it is, you have to make a distinction between that which is horrible and, can make you as an individual extremely upset, not poo-pooing the idea that someone calling you fat or ugly or any of those things is, you should just sort of get on with it. These are horrible things that I would prefer weren't out in the world. But that most of it exists in that realm. And actually, in terms of incitement to violence to women, I'm yet to see any kind of trend of incitement to violence to women online that would make me want to hand over emergency powers or anything else to the state. People use Andrew Tate as a kind of, I think, bogeyman in this regard. A deeply unpleasant, idiotic individual who has managed to capture the kind of, become the fever dream of parliamentarians who want to look like they're doing something in relation to women. He's got these sort of Fred Flintstone style kind of cartoonish views of women. And really interestingly, when you talk to and listen to interviews with young men who are interested in Andrew Tate, and there's been some really good sort of quotes that I've heard from BBC interviews and others, they say, oh, well, he's really successful. And you find out that they like him because he drives fast cars and, takes pictures with his abs out with loads of money. they're not interested in the women's style of the women's side of him. So I think we need to sort of be careful and say, what is the actual ill that we're trying to cure here? Is there a real problem, or are we, a bit like what I said before, trying to manufacture a panic? For me, the other point I'd like to make is that, you know, there's an element of us infantilizing ourselves when it comes to policing social norms. So, you know, I want us to be active citizens. Free speech comes with responsibilities, which means that if you are, as I am, a proponent of an absolutist view of free speech, which is that unless you are directly inciting violence in a way that can cause step over into the physical realm, then anything should go, no matter how unpleasant. And that's because I want people to be ready to have arguments. So when you see someone saying something objectionable, it's your duty as a member of the public square to step in and say, hang on a minute, you shouldn't say that, or I disagree with you. Now that can be an extremely knackering process on Twitter, and I'm sure, like me, lots of people just want to tune out. But it's our responsibility to create the world in which we want to live. And if we start saying that either, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, big tech billionaires out there, or their sort of employees who are in charge of social media conduct are going to decide what we can say to each other, or perhaps even worse, members of the Labour Party, then that doesn't seem satisfactory to me at all, because these people don't know how I think, they don't know how I feel, and they don't care. So I think we need to be much more active ourselves in self-policing, and that is a way in which things might actually change.
But Tim, yeah, could I just, Ella, just on that point, I just want to bring in one of you actually on this. Joe Ingham has written in about this issue and actually touches, Ella, on the point you make about Andrew Tate. Let's just read what Joe has said. She says, politicians don't have a clue. The kids actually laugh at Andrew Tate rather than follow him. They like his cars and muscles. Give them a bit of credit. They do see through it. If they want to tackle misogyny, maybe look closer to the way the poor young girls in Rotherham were labelled as prostitutes rather than victims by the authorities, and look at the culture that encourages their abuse in certain parts of society. But Tim, I did promise that we would ask, I wanted to ask you the same question about whether what has happened online over the past, let's say 5 years, has that changed your view at all about the role of law and regulation to control what some people would describe as incitement to violence when it comes to women, as Ella has dealt with, but more broadly as well? For me, I do have this conflict between what I see online, and this is obviously talking as a mixed black man, about people genuinely saying, go out and kill black people or Muslims. And it has changed my slight calculation, as also, Ella, I have so much sympathy with your points about free speech and not making everyone fearful.
I sympathise with Ella's view about free speech up to the point of committing violence, and also I like the idea of an actively engaged citizenry which is compelled to engage rather than depending upon the state to intervene. I guess it's almost like the American argument around guns, but applied to free speech. I don't rely upon the police to look after me. I have to own my own shotgun in order to do it. When it comes to online, I would lean towards a radical position of saying you can say what you like, but you're also held responsible for it. And the problem I have with social media companies is that they allow people to publish things, but they're not held to the same standards as a regular publisher. So the person who says the bad thing has to face social consequence for it, but also the person who publishes it should face civil, possibly legal consequence for it, in a way that I feel they currently don't do. But I guess what I would push back against what Ella is saying, and I'm playing devil's advocate to some extent here, is you're saying that it is our responsibility to stand up for ourselves. In principle, yes. But why should I have to do that? If I'm being abused by someone, why should I have to stand up for myself? They're abusing me. That's just a bad and immoral thing to do. If someone is racially abusing someone, why is the emphasis upon the person being racially abused to defend themselves? surely ethically the emphasis should be upon the person doing the abusing to shut up.
Well, I mean, how does anything ever change unless we see ourselves as part of some kind of collective experience, which is that, if you have the people who still hold, the men who still hold sexist views, I think we just need to get real here and kind of cut to the chase, are not going to be watching out for what kind of anti-misogyny legislation is published and then say, oh, do you know what? I was allowed to say this legally, or,
yes.
I was going to have my social media account, but as I might get a fine now, I probably won't. I probably change my mind. There's this superficiality to it, which is, are we interested in getting people to shut up? Which you can do through censorship. You can effectively do that tomorrow. You could make it illegal. You can silence people, but will you actually change their mind? And I'm more interested in the actually changing their mind thing.
I know, but that's because you're a very clever and engaged citizen. To take another analogy, let us say that my next door neighbour is playing offensively loud hardcore metal music, right? What I infer from what you're saying is that the responsibility lies with me to go and knock on their door and say, can you please not play that music? No, responsibility should be upon them not to play it. And if they are playing it, I'd like to be able to ring the police and say, please go and shut those people up. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Why should I have to risk my life? Why should I have to make the effort to ask someone to stop doing something which is totally objectionable?
Well, I think you might be slandering electronic music fans here by suggesting that they'd threaten your life if you
Paganini, whatever the music is, you take my point. Why should the person being affected, why should the person being hurt by what someone is doing be the one who is held responsible for stopping them from doing it?
Because we then just live in a perpetual victimhood status and a sort of, I think we kind of completely denude ourselves of all power if we say, why should I? It's a very, not to insult you, Tim, but it's a very childish position, which is that I should take no agency, I should take no responsibility for the things that happen around us. And we have to understand that, it's a bit like coming back to the harm principle, J.S. Mill. We live in a world in which people will annoy us and even maybe threaten us, and in which our freedom to play bad music that we like at a loud level will impinge on someone else's freedom to want to enjoy peace and quiet. And there is always going to be tension in relation to that, and that in the political realm too. For example, the differing religious views and what that means for women's freedom, as I think was sort of touched on by Joe Ingman's comment. All these things bring up tensions in society. If we want to live in a free society, tensions will abound, because you'll rub up against each other. How do we deal with that? For me, it is not by picking up the phone and calling the police, but by having interactions, rubbing along and working it out. And that's, a difficult prospect. That does mean conflict. That does mean disagreement. But I think that that's a far healthier social environment than one in which we are antisocial. We don't talk. We don't, debate with each other, whether it's on the sort of mundane day-to-day level, or the big P political level. And, the thing is, from a women's freedom position, I fear constantly that I come across as sounding like there's nothing to see here. It's something that I always, worry that people will think, because a lot of the time the counter to the kind of arguments of making misogyny a hate crime or whatever it is, criminalizing it, making it extremist, is just, oh, give over, girls. What are you whinging about? And that's not the case. There are some very serious things, for example, that this government is falling short on in relation to childcare, in relation to the row about the 2-child benefit cap. There are big things that we need to talk about in relation to women's freedom and things that I drastically like to change. There's some law that I would drastically like to change, abortion law being one of them. And if we if we sort of fail to have those arguments by saying the only problem that faces women is this violence issue and it's very serious and what we need to do is make everything illegal, then you shut down any of the possibility for having the nuanced discussions that we have to actually make women's lives better. You know, violence against women is a big deal. It's something that's very important. But if you stopped your average woman on the street and said, what would you really like to change, you know, to make your life materially better? They wouldn't use the F word. They wouldn't say anything about feminism. They wouldn't probably say anything actually about violence against women. They'd probably say something really boring to do and important to do with their energy bills or something else like that, you know. And that's, I'm not poo-pooing the discussion, very interesting discussion we've just had, but like, let's get real here. And I get angry at the fact that politicians constantly seek to speak on behalf of women in a patronizing way when they don't have much real attention or interest in looking at what women actually want.
Ella, thank you so much for your really deep and thoughtful answers to this debate. Please do get in touch with us, you know, on this. Do email us at thedailyt@telegraph.co.uk. You can also get in touch via socials, X, Instagram, and TikTok. Be polite, of course, because we're always polite at the Telegraph at Daily T Podcast. But we'd love to hear your views as well. But look, thanks so much, Ella. Lovely piece today in the Telegraph. Really enjoyed that, and what a good debate it is to have.
Thank you.
So Tim, Ella, very interesting there. I think she was talking. I thought the two of you, it was a very interesting discussion. I thought the two of you were talking about slightly different things, and I actually agree with both of you, of course, being a lovely liberal. But what I will say, you're absolutely right, Tim. If someone is, you know, shouting racist abuse in my window at home,
Yes.
the idea that I'm going to go out and engage with that person because I'm a member of civil society is not a thing, Tim.
Especially
I got
when it's
that.
illegal.
I got that, absolutely. I think, though, that Ella was actually making a slightly different point, which steps back quite a long way into contact theory. And the idea that the person, male or female, who is playing heavy metal next to you in your house late at night or, you know, whatever it might be, and annoying you, that person has not considered for a moment his or her impact on other people. So the socialization journey of community has broken down in some way for many, many people. And famous American book, Bowling Alone, which is all about the end of community, that we are all now in our own lanes and we live in these social media bubbles where we don't consider that Tim Stanley living next to me might love Paganini but doesn't like heavy metal. And therefore, why, when I'm at home, do I not blast music out all day, every day of my back garden?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking, well, my neighbours might not like it. It's not very socially friendly, so I won't do it. And it's about what's the difference between me, hopefully, as a relatively reasonable neighbour, and the neighbour sitting next to you. So she's making, I suppose, she's making a broader social community point. You're making a more direct, on-the-day response.
Yes, and again, as I said, I sympathise with her view, but the reality is that we still expect there to be a legal framework regarding noise, right? So to mansplain, I think that Ella is an example of a libertarian feminist, definitely a feminist, but she wants women to stand up for themselves and make change themselves, one person at a time. Jez Phillips and the government are an example of socialist feminists. They also want feminism, they also want women to make a difference, but they believe that should be then translated into law. And what they would argue is that Ella's right, it'd be nice to live in a world in which a man was a sexist, a woman said stop it, the man ceased to do it. And that society just sort of evolved towards becoming equal through the passionate exchange of ideas. The reality is that society has progressed in part via law. For instance, the banning of racial discrimination in the 1960s. If they hadn't done that, do you really think Britain would have changed as fast as it did had it not become literally unlawful to publicly racially discriminate? So when the second wave feminists, who I'm sure Ella would admire, in the 60s were campaigning for various things, yes, they wanted to generally create greater equality towards men and women, but they all also imagined that it would be translated into law. They didn't think we were going to create a sort of a law of the jungle situation in which the jungle, just as I say, evolved towards equality. No, it was always going to be pushed and nudged by the law.
Yeah, I think that the law can do a lot when there's nothing it becomes harder and harder at the margins to improve things by the law.
Yes.
Social change cultural change becomes much more important. Before the first Race Discrimination Act, it was not illegal to racially discriminate against people who were not white. So there was nothing, and then there was something. I think you're absolutely right in that situation. But the marginal gain from each new law piled on top of that, I think, becomes more difficult, and then culture does play a greater role.
And that's where I suspect we are at with this discussion about extreme misogyny. Not that they're talking about it becoming a law, but I think this is an example of the government saying something for the sake of throwing something into the mix, so it looks like a government is doing something. But I suspect when you're dealing with people like Andrew Tate, this is a cultural problem. The problems facing men are things like the collapse of manufacturing, lagging behind in education, the decline of strong male archetypes for them to follow, the collapse of the nuclear family. It's less Andrew Tate. Okay, you could theoretically ban Andrew Tate, and then none of those pressures facing men would go away. And those are the things which I suspect direct men towards misogyny. So it's those areas where I don't think the law or strategies change anything. But I just come back to the reality is sometimes you need a bit of law, because otherwise people will just, with impunity, behave very badly towards each other.
As you say, Tim, we mustn't forget there is just politics. This is the middle of August. It's relatively quiet. The government announces a review. It vaguely sounds to the public of, oh, they're possibly doing something. But alongside the reviews, well, the Online Safety Act, which is obviously connected, because this idea of harmful but legal, could it be resurrected by the government? We've got the review on extremism, which is Yvette Cooper has announced, as we're discussing. We've already got a review on defence, on education and the curriculum, on childcare, on the NHS. I think in the Labour Party manifesto before the election, there were, I think, 14 reviews announced. It's the way of the government. You get 2 or 3 bites at the cherry, don't you? Mm. The public hear the review headline. Nothing's actually changed, of course, but the public hear government doing something. Mm. They then hear government doing something when they publish the review. Again, no actual action. Mm. And then they publish possible, maybe not in this case, but usually some legislation or policy proposal. Oh, that's another moment. So the naked politics of this is just the way that governments command the news cycle, and we mustn't lose sight of that.
Yeah.
Now, Tim, to make you a star, obviously, you need to be incredibly funny, which you are, Tim, because you've made a couple of jokes literally in this podcast, which is lovely to see. But today it's been revealed the supposed, this is voted on by critics, so who knows, but the supposed funniest joke of Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And Tim, we've made you, ever since this morning, not hear this joke.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell you the joke.
Can't wait.
And your response is going to be the final decider on whether this is genuinely the funniest joke of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. So here it is. It's by Mark Simmons. I was going to sail around the globe. Sorry. Let me try that again. It's so funny I can't even read it. I was going to sail around the globe in the world's smallest ship, but I bottled it. Not
That's
bad.
very Tim Vine, isn't it?
Not bad.
That's
so,
very, it's
now,
clever.
Tim, Camilla and I have both told you already our favourite jokes, and I'm not going to remind everybody of mine. But Tim, everyone on the podcast, I think, needs to have a chance to tell their favourite joke. So, Tim, we would love to hear yours. And because I love a joke, I might just tell my second favourite, because you've already heard my first favourite, which I know you've been sharing with your family and friends ever since.
All right, okay. Man goes into a pub, orders a pint, decides he wants a cigarette, goes to the machine, and the cigarette machine says to him, "Oh, aren't you ugly?" In his shock, he goes back to the bar, sticks his hands in the nuts, and the nuts say to him, "Oh, you're gorgeous." The man says to the landlord, "What the hell's going on?" The landlord says, "Oh, sorry, I should have told you. The machine is out of order, but the nuts are complimentary."
That's him. That is not bad. I think my children will be hearing that joke.
It's clean.
It's clean?
It's clean. That's my one standard for comedy. Is it clean?
Can I tell my second favourite?
Please do.
I'm so sorry to all of you for putting this upon you. I say, now you've got to get into the spirit of this joke. So it's the classic back and forth, okay?
Right.
So, I say. What's the secret of great comedy?
I don't know. What is
Timing.
Very good.
Works better like that. Thank you, everyone. Do join us again tomorrow, 5 o'clock.